Good morning, everyone. Thank you
Hi.
so much for all joining us today for the session on bookselling in Australia. My name is Heather and I'm the Communications Manager at Writing WA, and I will be your gracious host this morning. I'd like to first respectfully acknowledge that this session is taking place on the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this land and elders past, present and emerging. A few house rules just before we get started. We kindly ask that you keep your cameras and mics off during the discussion, and we will have plenty of time at the end for questions. So if you do have something to ask, make sure you pop it in the chat box when we get there. This session will be recorded and will be available for you to view about a week after we finish. So if you don't want to have your face recorded, just make sure your camera's switched off as well. Now, with that aside, it is my real pleasure to welcome Jane Seaton, the President of the Australian Booksellers Association and owner of Beaufort Street Books in Mount Lawley. Jane has been a member of the ABA Board of Management since 2014, and she was appointed President in June this year. Jane, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Thank you, Heather. And it's so nice to have so many people popping up on the screen. Before I do start, though, I'd like to also say that I'm coming from Whadjuk Noongar country, and I wish to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
I wanted to take a moment as well, Jane, to congratulate you on your appointment as President of the ABA. It's really exciting to have a great WA bookseller in that role.
Thank you. Interestingly, I was looking back at some of the history for the ABA, and whilst we formed in 1922, and generally the presidency is a 2-year position and then followed up by a 2-year position as the immediate past president, there is a predominance of males that have been president over that time. Probably 1 in 4. It ends up being a female, which is really bizarre in a pretty heavily female dominant industry, particularly in bookselling. But it is, my appointment was the first WA president, which is
really?
It's nuts. I know, it was. I didn't realize that, but when I was looking back through the names, I'm like, wow, that's
mad. That's truly mad.
It is mad, isn't it?
Well, we're very happy to have you there now. It's yeah. Couldn't think of a better person to be the first
Thank you.
WA rep. So seeing as we're on the ABA, to kick us off, could you explain to everyone a little bit about what the Australian Booksellers Association is and the role it plays in the publishing and bookselling sector in Australia?
Well, as I said, it was formed in 1922 and it is a not-for-profit organisation. It was primarily formed to provide advocacy and support to the booksellers in their communities through training, through advocacy work, through working with the other partners that make up our industry, being the Australian Publishers Association, the Australian Society of Authors, and the Indigenous Literacy Foundation, which was formed through the work of a bookseller in Susie Wilson, who has Riverbend Books in Queensland, and also the Library Association as well. So we work primarily with those 4 groups to help support booksellers and bookstores in their communities.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the membership of the ABA is involved with a really big proportion of the industry, probably a little more than most people might anticipate with a name like the Australian Booksellers Association. Mm-hmm. What kinds of businesses are members of the ABA?
Well, yeah, as you've alluded to, it's not just bookstores. There's about 460 members currently, mm-hmm. and predominantly they are bookstores. There's, I think it's about 75% are independent stores. Mm-hmm. We do also have members from Collins Group and Dymocks Group, but also publishers and associate members, whether they are already a member of another similar organisation. be it Retailers Association or something along those lines. Recently, there's been a number of more news agency groups that have come in, particularly in regional towns. They may not have a bookstore, and so the news agent is tending to pick up that role of selling books to that community. We also do have individual members, which is a person who is intending on opening a bookstore and joins to be able to access some of the support materials and support personnel to help them open their store. And that's how I first joined. And typically people are usually 12 to 18 months in doing that research before they will then go on to open a store and become independent members then.
Yeah, so it's a really massive like chunk of what makes up the Australian industry.
Yeah, and it's by having an organisation that is 75% indies, the ABA recently formed their own buying group. So it means that we can have the power when there's 350 odd independent stores that we are speaking for when we're speaking to publishers. So you can have some better margins that you can create on some key titles, similar to what the Dimmicks Group and Collins Group do for their members. So it's pretty important that, and one of the other advantages of being a member of the ABA is we have a group, an account with the Australian Post. And so rather than me going to Australia Post and getting pretty much rack rates, I can go, the ABA goes on my behalf along with 350 other stores, and so we can have a better buying capacity, and it's something that we just pass on to our customers. So if they need something posted, we just pass on those rates, and a lot of bookstores do that. Just yeah.
I think that like segues really nicely into my next question, which is the kinds of recent cross-sector advocacy work that the ABA has been doing for different businesses, particularly in what has been a pretty tumultuous couple of years.
It most definitely has. And, the world didn't exist before COVID, did it really? What were we all doing?
Can't remember.
It has been quite significant over the last 18 months. The board of management and Robbie Egan, the CEO, he's been in the CEO position for 3 years now, so he's sort of had to hit the ground running there for a while. And a lot of the work that he's been doing is petitioning on the members' behalf to parliamentary groups, both state and federal, providing us letters as well that we can then add weight to it, so there's more than just one voice saying the same thing. And on typically in areas such as what is deemed an essential business, and it's an interesting clarification, and it's not uniform across the country, interestingly. And we're seeing at the moment that most of the East Coast is in lockdown, but even the differences between Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra are different as to whether you can go out and service online orders that come through. I know in one of the lockdowns that we've had, I can't remember which one, wasn't the first one, the second or the third one, there was quite a bit of discussion among a number of us, the booksellers, because it wasn't clear whether we were able to go and pack an order online and deliver it in a COVID safe way to the post office, like online businesses that we know. That were doing that. And I actually rang the COVID line and said, can I go and pack an order and deliver it in a COVID safe way to the Australia Post? And I was told, but you would be breaching one of the reasons why you're leaving home. So whereas the first lockdown, we were trading anywhere from 30 to 50% up on the prior year. It was nuts, absolutely nuts. But it was a different sort of busy. It wasn't like a Christmas busy. That, along with the stress of the responsibility to your staff and responsibility to your community, we inherently want to put books in hands to enrich their lives, and being able to do that in a safe way was just really tricky. And I know I was working sort of from 5 a.m. to 2 a.m, often. It was just nuts.
Crazy. And it's correct that there's no sort of like federal sort of bit of policy that explains whether bookstores are considered essential. It's all very like state
No,
level.
it's not. And, it's something prior to COVID we were talking about in looking at the value and importance of bookstores in that whole education space. And bookstores are that third place of learning outside of libraries and universities. And, if I look on Google at my business and it says, I just happened to notice when I was changing some of the opening hours or, whether we're going to be open on a public holiday. And it says on there, people typically spend 46 minutes in your store. So that's an average of everybody that goes through, even if it's just to drop in and pick up a card or to an event.
Yeah.
But if that's an average of 46 minutes, that's a lot of exposure to what I choose to expose in the store, which I know we're going to chat to it a bit later, but that's an interesting fact in how you present the books for people to see in your store.
Yeah.
And discover, really. That's what a bookstore is about. It's about discoverability, and it's been the biggest problem of lockdown is not being able to have that browsing and discoverability.
Yeah, exactly. And it really like indicates that that's really how people, it suggests that's how people spend time in stores is browsing, not just sort of going in to get the latest release and leaving.
Well, and that's the thing, just in the last 18 months, it has been times of up and times of down. Originally, as I mentioned earlier, we had high sales. And I know other stores did. A lot of people turned back to reading. Just looking at some of those figures in what people were reading, interestingly, there was a significant jump in backlist titles. Significant. Up 22% or something rather ridiculous.
And for people listening, backlist as a term means books that basically haven't been published in the last year. So books that have been around a bit longer than new releases that will be marketed really heavily.
From a sales point of view, we talk about the long tail, and I'm sure people will have heard of that. And basically, you want one of your books to be in that long tail because it means ongoing royalties.
Yeah.
So, that's the key thing, getting it into that.
So you kind of touched on it a little bit already, but obviously the pandemic has impacted the market and it's sort of changed the patterns of book sales throughout the year. Can you tell us a little bit about what has happened to the bookselling market in Australia since sort of March last year?
Well, interestingly, as I said, people did turn back to reading. I think there was, Zoom was a wonderful opportunity for people to stay in touch, but people did get a little sick of screens. For us, when we went into that initial lockdown in March, it coincided with the school holidays here. And so people were coming in droves, not just buying 3 or 4 books. They were buying, 10 and 14
stockpiling.
Stockpiling. But they're the true core readers. It was our customers, but it did expand reading as well. So, people were coming in, and that's probably where that backlist title grew. People were coming in going, I've always wanted to read Dickens, or I've always wanted to read, these titles that have always been there, and hey, they've got a lot of time now, they can do that. So I think that's what was happening. Interestingly, when I look at the figures that were presented at our conference in June, though, they gave some very rosy year-to-date figures for the first 6 months of the year. And, even though last year sales were up in general, and reading Australian authors was up, in June of this year, again, it was up. Overall, the industry was up about 12%. People were reading more Australian authors as well, significantly. From June to now, though, is very different. And recently we had a Nielsen figure that came out that looked at period 8, which is the 2 weeks, the last 2 weeks in July and the first 2 weeks of August. And I went back and just checked where the eastern states were in terms of their lockdown. Sydney, we know, complete lockdown. And Melbourne, interestingly, in that 4-week period, were in lockdown for 21 days of the 28 days across 2 separate lockdowns.
Mm-hmm.
The one that they are in now had just started, and so there was about 8 days of it in there. So essentially, we've got 60% of Australia's population that were in lockdown for that period. So it's probably not surprising to then tell you that the market was down 20%.
Mm-hmm.
Or it was about 18 point something, rather 20%, which is really significant given only, 5 weeks prior to that, they were reporting upwards of 10% growth on the year prior. When I look at my figures, and it would be similar to probably other WA stores, apart from I appreciate the CBD stores are really sort of facing an all sort of different problem, and it is in CBDs all around Australia,
Mm-hmm.
because there's still a lot of people working from home, even when here in WA we're able to go back to work. And I think that will continue to happen. But if I look at WA in general, and we certainly had the budget figures come out yesterday, and there's growth, and there is retail growth,
Mm-hmm.
where it's by no means easy street. We are up. In April of this year, we were down 30%.
Mm-hmm.
That was around a lockdown for us. But in the last few months, we have done okay. So if we're doing okay in WA, it will be at 9% or thereabouts
Mm-hmm.
for population. If 60% are down 20%,
Mm.
that means, unfortunately, that 60% of the buying population are not able to go in and buy a book in a bookstore, which is going to affect WA authors because your books are being sold all around Australia.
Yeah, for sure.
And if you go back and have a think of it in terms of that, 46% of people spend 46 minutes in my store. So that's not happening over East. So it is having a big effect, and it is quite a concern for the industry in general through publishing and through bookstores. We might be able to trade pretty much normally here, but we are, if 60% of our market is having an effect to these Christmas titles, I think, what's that going to do for publishing down the track? What's it going to do for book prices next year? Not even to consider that those authors that are still pursuing and publishing into these lockdown periods, it's not all rosy despite our ability to be open and trading here.
Yeah. I really feel for authors who have, especially like debut authors who have new books coming out, and then a lockdown comes along, because it really changes how much they're able to like reach new readers and build relationships with bookstores. And yeah, you mentioned then as well, sort of books by Australian authors doing quite well within that sort of like set of data. How has Australian writing fared overall in the past 18 months or so? Has there been growth in that area? Yeah,
there has. We particularly was of note in September of last year. There were a lot of authors that got published into these lockdown times. I know when we went into lockdown in March, we were 2 days away from doing an event with Dervla McTernan for her 3rd book. And we had, I think, 50, 60 people prepared that were going to pop into the store and have, just celebrate with her. So in really very immediate fashion, we had to learn how to use one of these things.
Yeah.
And it wasn't brilliant on the night. We couldn't get video happening, but we got to share in it. And another author, Natasha Lester, was prepared to do an event with another store, a Dimmick store, with Mary Fate and a friend of mine who was going to do the conversation. And so they were all ready to go. And I said, and Mary, all her work with what she was doing was completely cut as well, like a lot of people in that arts type industry area. So I said, look, if you're ready to go, Natasha's ready to go, we've done one of these, let's just do another one. And so we did. We just basically provided a vehicle for people for them to do what they were going to be doing anyway. And it continued from there with what we were doing with these conversations and coming to people's, into people's lounge rooms. But going back to it, in September of last year, when we traditionally see a lot of new releases coming into the market from Australian and international, the voices and the stories that were coming into our bookstores were predominantly, the strength was in the Australian publishing and Australian writing. There were still international good books, but there really was a resounding strength, and it was refreshing, I think, because we all were going through still tough times. So it was really a breath of fresh air. And it's not to say that there weren't Australian stories before. There seemed to be more of them and an intensity to them. And I'd been noticing in the Nielsen figures at conferences for the past 5 years, there was commentary about the increase in Australian stories and Australian voices. They often look at the top 10 in the total market and where they're coming from, or the top 20. And 5 years ago, a lot of what we were reading still was dominated by US and UK voices. But, in the last 5 years, it's been increasingly Australian stories that are prevailing. And it's wonderful to see, I've got to say.
Yeah. And you've said that, like, within our industry too, there's a lot of support for those writers that you've seen. Yeah. So speaking more broadly, sort of touched on Australian authors, looking at it from a sort of top level perspective, have you noticed any trends in the genre or style of books that have been quite popular?
Yeah, it was interesting when we were sort of faced with COVID. A lot of publishers were pulling out some of their stories that had been published before that involved plagues and viruses and Armageddon and that sort of thing.
Charming, isn't it?
And look, there was a certain percentage of readers that wanted to read that. I don't know if they were going to find any answers. I certainly didn't want to read anything like that. But people would come into the store or ring up, and it's maintained this since the COVID all started last year in March. They wanted something that was going to take them somewhere else, not to somebody else's problems. Please don't give me somebody else's problems. I've got enough on my plate. And so they were looking for a true escapism. Whether that, you could still get a crime novel that was going to allow people escapism without it being a plague involved or a pandemic. But it was a character-driven novel that was a page turner and allowed people to forget. And another area is what we changed. We developed a new genre a few years ago after I went to a conference. We call it feel-good reads, and there's feel-good fiction and feel-good non-fiction. The industry, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, also started calling it uplit, which I don't know, it just doesn't gel with me, uplit. Something
really
about
roll
it
off the tongue, doesn't
really roll off. You got to be careful how you say it as well.
Yeah.
And so feel-good reads really encapsulated to us. So it was a read that was going to make you laugh. It was going to, whether it be fiction or non-fiction, but it was quality writing as well. So again, very character-driven. And more and more people we were finding actually had been after a section like this for a while. If someone's trying to buy a gift for somebody who's in hospital, they want something that's someone's not going to die in necessarily, or a plane, So it's actually been, when we had that section all there. So when COVID hit, to have that there and as a go-to was brilliant for us. And I think more and more we're seeing that. I'm not telling people who shouldn't write about plagues. There is, you know, they are good stories.
There's
A lot of people
book for everyone.
There's a book for everyone.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, I mean, how important is thinking about genre as a bookseller? How important is it when you see new books come across your desk, placement in the store? How does it factor in?
You know, genre, it is something that the industry uses and publishers use and booksellers use. And do you know what? It's there to be played with. When we opened the store 11 years ago, we just had fiction and we had the various elements of non-fiction. We didn't separate Australian fiction out. And it was probably about 7 years ago we did separate it out, and that area has been more and more of a focus. When we separated it out, we also positioned it in the store. So it is, so when you walk into the store, typically people turn right when they walk into a store because people are right-handed. So we designed the layout so that the counter was on the left as they walked around the store and they came back out. And so you walk in the store and you head straight to the fiction table, which is new releases or ones that are getting a buzz. And then you sort of look around a new release bay, and Australian fiction is sitting there right next to crime. You have to go around the corner to get to international fiction. Interestingly, international fiction in our store, as far as floor space or the linear shelf space, is shrinking, and Australian fiction is growing more and more. So that has to be reflective of consumer demand, publisher printing, which is just, you know, interesting. And the other area of genre, actually, it's probably a good time to talk about the Matthew Riley scenario that we were talking about.
Absolutely.
So I heard this a number of years ago when we were talking at a conference about genre and how you label a book and where you position it. And actually, in terms of that, it was in the context of New Age, which was developed a while ago, and it was that age group between young adult and adult fiction. Again, it didn't gel with me, so we didn't sort of set it up. But it was that's why we ended up, this story came to me. And Matthew Riley, who's published millions of books, when he first started the Jack West series, I think it is, that was, I think it was that series, but the first 3 books were labeled as fantasy. And when you look at the sales of fantasy fiction compared to just general fiction, there's vast differences. And so I think it was about the 3rd or the 4th book, they changed it. They did a jacket change, and they then said it was fiction and put him in a different section of the store. And so they published the next few novels in that, and then they went back and rejacketed the first 3 and made sure that they were pigeonholed in fiction rather than fantasy, which is just interesting that you know, the way publishers change up things to give it a different position in the store. I know, chatting to an author recently who's looking to do some work on a book which is about parenting, in particular fathering, and we were having a chat about it. And, you know, typically you would put that in the parenting section, but I said, look, you really, when you're thinking about how you're writing this, think about where you want it in the store, because there's this section, we used to call it self-help, and it was, you know, tiny shelf, was knee level. Apparently nothing sells below knee level in a store. So if your books are below knee level, just put them up somewhere near someone's elbow or eyesight. So we had this self-help section that was really tiny. I went to conference and they talk at the Nielsen gives this genre map of what is moving and what is growing within genres. And for a couple of years, this it was development and self-improvement type titles, which was quite broad, but they were just continuing to grow. It's really the strength in that non-fiction area. And I came back and I said to the guys in the shop, I said, I think we've got to do something here. And so we did. We moved it. We moved it to the front of the store. We more than quadrupled the stock holding. It pretty much is the section you see when you come in and turn right. That is the section you see. And we changed it from self-help to calling it better living, which is just such a more positive way of looking at those books that are about coping with anxiety, with self-improvement, whether it be, you know, the books on resilience. There's books in there on religion, on all sorts of areas. And, you know, our sales have significantly grown. And that's just through playing around with genre.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, talking to this particular author, I said, you need to think about it and write it in that way that you want it to live in that section of the bookstore, not necessarily in parenting. You're going to have a lot more people picking it up.
Yeah.
So I think that's in writing something, it's important to think about the reader and how the reader is going to come to that book. What is their purchase decision going to be, and where is it going to live in that genre map of a store?
And it really alludes to that point you were making, that genre isn't necessarily a pigeonhole that you put yourself in. It's like an active sort of thing that gets thought about at all different levels of the industry, from writers to booksellers to
definitely
publishers too. Yeah, I think it's really useful advice for someone who's thinking about putting their book out into the world. So kind of moving on from that, I wanted to touch on title lists and sell-in lists themselves, because the list of new books being published that booksellers receive is really extensive. And for people who work in publishing, title lists will be pretty familiar. But can you tell us exactly what a title list is and how booksellers will work through these?
Okay, so we see either in person or through telesales. Each book, the buyer in a store will have the reps visit them and talk through the month's list. And, you know, some lists literally, like, so I've got a bit of November ordering to do today. So this is some of it, as you can see there. That's only just some of it. Weighty, yeah. But important stuff. And so on the top here is only 3, obviously one's gone missing, 3 of the 4 lists through Allen and Unwin. Allen and Unwin are a great Australian supporter of Australian work, obviously, but they have a number of imprints that they also supply to the Australian market, being Bloomsbury. And so typically on these lists, there's like Allen and Unwin, they will probably show me in a sell-in around 280 titles, maybe. Like Penguin Random House, it will be probably around 400 titles just in an average month. The way they present them on the sheets is really important, I think. So this is the fiction for Allen and Unwin, and you can see here that we don't get jacket covers, which is a little unfortunate, but it's costly to print these with jacket covers. But that makes a big difference to me. What they do note in the Allen and Unwin, which I think is really good, is if it's an Australian author. Penguin Random House do that as well. So that's something that I look out for when I'm going through the list. When you get a, like, HarperCollins, they do have pictures and colour on there. So this is their key titles. And so predominantly as part of a buying group, these key titles are the ones that I can negotiate to get some extra terms on. And they're the ones that the publisher's going to do the focusing on. So that's the, you know, if I look at the rest of the HarperCollins list, it doesn't have jacket covers, which is a shame. because we do judge a book by its cover, and I remember books through their covers as well. But you can see here that, you know, they're going through the list, and I make notes on it in one color, and then when I go through to do the ordering, I use another color pen, just to make it easier. So that's, you know, it's a lot of printing that goes into it. There's a lot of time that goes into it, but it's easy to miss titles as well.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot you're getting presented.
And is it both the front list and back list that are included in those sellings? Yeah,
so like when you go through the titles, you'll have the author's new title, and then the publisher will list some of the previous titles, particularly if it's a series, but also some of the other ones, to remind you to get them back in. Fortunately, the way the publishing industry works now, it didn't 5 years ago even, is almost all publishers allow you to order a book in, and if you haven't sold it in 12 months from that invoice date, to return it. And that's really important for backlist, to give it a chance. With some of the backlist titles in the core areas that I look at and that we stock, you know, a book, if it sells 3 times a year, I'm happy to keep it in. But and that's even if it's not sale or return. There's only one publisher, or 2 publishers at the moment, that your fiction titles, backlist titles, are not sale or return on invoice date. And I think it makes it harder to keep those titles in. But it also probably heightens the work that goes into managing so many SKUs, if you like, single unit items, and you might only hold 1 or 2 on your shelf of all of those titles. So yeah, it's a fun job, and you know, it's a great industry to be involved in, I have to say.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's so much work that goes into all of that thing, those things that sort of happen behind the scenes. So on title lists, obviously diversity and representation have been really important conversations across the board in the industry. When you're looking through those title lists, have you seen, or are you seeing any kind of change in the representation of diverse voices on those lists?
In general, I think we're seeing a slight increase, but not nearly where it can be. You know, interestingly, the conference that was held in June of this year had a theme to it in diversity and publishing in that respect. And you know, there is still a reluctance for people, I think, to stand up and own it. And unfortunately, we're seeing people of colour still having to be the ones that are fighting to have their voices heard. And it shouldn't be that way as an industry. We even saw one of the footballers recently saying he's sick of being the one to have this conversation all the time. It's time for some other people to have that conversation. And I think it is. And, you know, we predominantly only see what is presented to us. We have a choice in what we can put into the store from what we see on these lists. And because bookstores, independent bookstores, truly try to reflect their community and the people coming into the community, coming into their stores. Yeah, but we're only as good as the list that we get presented. So there was a talk, a panel conversation on diversity at the recent conference, and from that and that general summary that I've just given then, because we do have a buying group that is the ABA, Robbie made a point of actually saying, look, okay, I'm going to start using some of my power for that good, and to championing books to mean that we get, you know, if it means we're getting extra terms to put them on our shelves, to make them more front and center, then publishers will start taking note and, you know, and then providing the marketing materials to go around that. There's a, you know, I think we need to see that. And I was watching again, Tony Birch gave the keynote address for the conference, and he said, you know, people of colour and First Nations people have been reading about other stories all their lives. And they're not going to not talk about those stories, but, you know, the books that they've been reading have helped form their writing voice as well. So I think the more that we can have a true representation of what Australia is, and let's face it, if you're not a First Nations person, you or your relatives have somehow come here either on a boat or a plane, unless you're an Indigenous person. So we need to reflect, like we're seeing growth in Australian voices. I want us to see growth in true Australian voices and a true representation of what our communities are. I think we've got a long way to go.
Yeah, it's really good to hear your insights in that regard, because I think it's really good to check in sometimes, because there's often a difference between the publicity and the data of what's happening, and to keep moving forward, we need to know where we are at different points as an industry.
And I think what you said then, it's really important to check in. And, you know, even as a business owner, it's too easy to just keep doing what you're doing and keep ordering what you're ordering, as opposed to standing back from your business and saying, okay, what am I doing? Who am I representing? Who do I want to be known for? You know, the voices that are on the shelves, am I providing the right avenue? Because, you know, there are three types of books, and many people on this probably know this. There are the known knowns, the book you know about that you've probably read, the unknown knowns, the ones that you know about but you haven't read yet, and then the unknown unknowns, which is the discoverability that a bookstore gives you. And that's where we have a responsibility to all Australians to represent them in the voices that are on the shelves, I think.
Absolutely. And it's not something that can just be siloed into one part of the industry to do. It's got to be holistic, and knowledge and conversation is just the best tools we have to you know, make change in a meaningful way in different spaces. Conscious of the time, I think this is probably a good moment to open up for any questions that people might have. So if you have questions, please do drop them in the chat box. I'm just going to have a look. So the first one from a little moment ago, Sasha would love to know what you meant by selling in a title 3 times a year.
Oh, okay. So a particular book, it's a backlist title. If it sells 3 copies a year, I will happily, which it doesn't sound like a lot at all, to sell 3 copies of one book in a year. But if it's an important book, then it's going to stay on the shelf. I had a person who rang the other day and wanted a copy of Jonathan Safran Foer's Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close. I get it around the wrong way. And he had rung 7 bookstores before he rang ours, and we had it, which I was rather pleased about. And then he said, oh, and do you happen to have Matt Haig's The Comfort Book? And I said, yeah, we do. Oh, and actually, while I'm there, do you have this book? Yeah, we do. I said, great, I'll be there in 20 minutes. Would you like them gift wrapped? Oh my God, that'd be awesome. How much will that cost? Nothing, just a smile on your face will be good. And so we got 3 sales just because we had that one book. Interestingly, I was talking to the rep about that, the publisher rep, and I said, you know, we had that book. She's like, really? Why? And I'm like, I had a look at the sales. We actually hadn't sold it for 3 years, so it was still sitting there. But you know, that is the hit and miss nature of curating the best backlist. In this time coming up to Christmas, all stores will be looking to put books like that potentially back on their shelf for that gift giving experience that happens, you know, in the next 3 months. So long way to answer that question, but I hope I answered it appropriately.
It's quite a complicated process as
Oh,
well.
it is,
like there's a lot of thought that goes into it. I think it's really useful. A couple other questions. What factors do you think have prompted the increase in consumer interest in Australian books?
What factors have prompted the consumer? I think it is the Australian psyche is to look after ourselves. So I think it's probably been a little bit a subconscious thought process. Let's face it, Australian authors have been writing stories for years, so it's not something new. We do have, you know, there's always new Australian voices coming into the market. I think they have a different way they present a story to us, which is why, you know, it's quite unique sometimes, those stories that go off to other shores. I was listening to a conversation with Anne Patchett recently, where she was talking. She owns a bookstore in Parnassus in the US as well, and some people will be familiar with her fiction probably more so than her non-fiction, but she does have a lovely collection of essays coming out in late November. And so the bookselling industry was having a Zoom conversation with her about that, and she talked about what books have what stories have been across her desk that she's loved hand selling through this time. And the one book that she said was her best book to hand sell at the moment was Meg Mason for her book. And I'm like, yeah, Australian stories, you know. And she's like, no, if you read this right, you just buy this. You can buy other books, but you have to buy this. Which it really heartened me to think that, you know, there's Anne Patchett, who's in her bookstore, struggling through COVID as well, like the rest of us, as an author, but also as a business owner. And she's just shoving Australian books into people's hands, which, you know, I think is great.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Really good to hear. It's awesome. Got another question. Kevin is asking, do you only see what is presented to you by publishers, or do you also seek out other books that may not come to you across those lists?
We do have the reps only come and present these lists, but we do, most bookstores across Australia do take on other books that have been somewhat either self-published or through, generally it's a self-published book that's coming to us like that. And, you know, first and foremost, regardless of whether that book suits our customer base, because not every book is going to be suitable for those shelves, depending on what people are coming in and what the community is. But first and foremost, I have to congratulate the person for the dedication to writing the story and often financing to get it published themselves. And most stores across Australia will take those on, more so indies than some of the Dimmicks or Collins. They just don't have it in their franchise ability to sometimes do that, and it's a head office thing. It's not necessarily the store, which is unfortunate. The difficulty with those books is that they then are presented to the consumer along with the other books that have had all the publishing support, the roundtable meetings on what jacket cover to use. And it's unfortunate because we do judge books by the covers. We really do. If I'm you know, I made comment before about a list that actually doesn't have a jacket cover next to it. I'm less likely to hone in on that, as if there is a jacket cover and the image tells me a story through that. We you know, visual literacy is such a thing that we talk about in the industry now.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't dissuade people who have self-published a book to get out there and try and get it on people's shelves, but also understand that if it's a children's book, and a lot of books are in a face-out display, you've got a consumer looking at all of that, and you just have to be realistic. The best thing, all you can do is go and front up and ask, really, and I encourage them to do so.
Yeah, especially with your local stores as well.
Definitely, yeah.
If your story is about place or relevant to, yeah.
Well, we did have, there's a person that published a guide to Perth, Live and Love in Perth. And she came through and saw us, and I can't tell you how many we've sold of those now. Just a lovely little guide. We keep it on the counter. You know, there's a lot of books like that we do sell a significant number of, and bookstores do, you know.
Yeah, we've got quite a few questions coming in.
A
slight follow-up to that one. Kevin was just asking, do you actually seek books out? So I guess clarifying whether booksellers research, you know, outside.
No, we don't actively. I don't, because I don't have time.
Yeah.
That would probably be the reason. I mean, I do work 7 days a week still. And I still, my office is a mess. I work 5 days, 5 days from home essentially. But I use that time also to visit schools and go and support what's happening in the store. If there are authors coming through, if I can, if I don't have appointments, I try and go into the store while they're coming in to sign their books. Sometimes I have reps, you know, and I just can't get out of it at home. If I'm in the I started seeing reps at home, because if I'm in the store, I'm too often drawn out to go and talk to customers, because that's my great love. And you know, Saturday and Sundays when I'm in the store. So yeah, I do work 7 days a week, and I've never worked harder in any role. I've never been paid so little in any role. But it is truly a labor of love. It's probably the best job I've ever had, which is quite bizarre given I get paid in free books. But you know, I feel like I genuinely love the community that we live in.
Also, it's so important if you're writing and wanting to sort of like build a relationship with your local booksellers to go in store and just kind of like see how it's all working and have conversations with the booksellers.
And not the months before your book's coming out as well. You know, I think that, interestingly, I had an author tell me once that when their book was sold in an Australian store, $30 book, I think they got $3 of every book. When it was sold through Book Depository, they got 3 cents.
Such a difference.
It is such a difference. And if Australian stories are selling through independents, I think 1 in 4 books that was sold last year is an Australian book, but 28% of the books that go through indies are Australian. So indies do support Australian authors across any greater than any other segment where your book can be sold. And I think that if the royalties are going to be greater, that's the place where people, you know, we're fighting this online, the Amazons of things. Interestingly, I'll give you a little bit of good news. We are, as the ABA, are looking at there's a thing called bookshop.org, which is in the US and the UK. So they've actually it's basically a collection of all of the indie stores. So you can go and say, I want X book. And so you go into this site and it says, oh, this store here, which is the closest to you, has it in stock. And so you go and buy it from that store. And so the ABA is looking at having a model like that. And it's because it's speed to get things into people's hands. That's what we want to do. People are using online to discover. And, you know, I think it's not going to happen this year. We're hoping it will happen next year, but we're also looking at getting a digital voucher system happening so that people can continue to support Australian stores, but online, because let's face it, COVID's not going away.
Yes, very true.
So there's some exciting things happening in the industry, I've got to say.
Yeah, absolutely. That bookshop.org platform is really good.
Really
it
good.
launched whilst I was working in the UK, and it was
really
so, it was, and especially last year, it was such a positive thing to have come about. Just having a look, Anne-Marie wanted to ask if you could repeat a bit more about the genre map concepts of the bookshop layout you were talking about.
So don't think I've got a picture of one here, but so imagine, like you can probably all see on your screens, there's lots of little squares. And so Nielsen Book Data, who is the biggest recorder of the industry data, they look at what the size of a market. So say if it's fiction is 25%, then 25 there's a tile that is 25% of the whole tile, and then they look at the growth. And so on that tiled map, if it's darker in color, it's significantly growing as opposed to the lighter in color ones. So it just, you know, apart from volume of that genre or that market, you want to know what's got the growth area. And so the takeaways from the last couple of meetings has been Australian fiction has been growing, and in non-fiction, particularly that the better living section, as we like to call it, which, you know, and things like Phosphorescence fits in there, the Julia Baird book. Charlotte Wood has a new one coming out, which will sort of be in that space as well. So hopefully that answers that genre map growth area.
I think it does. And they're also asking who makes it, and Nielsen is
it's Nielsen. And I'm sure you can probably, anyone can get data from Nielsen. We get it because we submit our data. So across the country, bookstores have all of their sales that go into a pool so that Nielsen can provide us each week. Those that submit their data get data back. And so we get a top 100 overall market, and then like the top 100 just within the independent market. So it allows me to see, particularly on that, the average selling price of things, and I can tell whether something is selling more so in a big W than it is in a bookstore. But then you get titles that are sold across the market. So it helps me see if I've missed something as well. If it's selling majority, like interestingly, The Magician, Colm Toibone's new book, that just came out as in the top, the #1 position in the indie market. Unfortunately, there's no stock, and it won't be any stock till the end of September. So whatever you had, you know, if you sold out,
that's it. Wicked. Well, I've actually got 2 more questions. We are out of time, if you're happy to stay on for a couple of extra minutes. So Claire was talking about you know, sale and return and that sort of thing. She said, are you open to taking books from independent Australian authors which can't be returned? So I guess maybe an author who's self-publishing and doesn't have a sale or return type offer on the table.
In general, no. But it depends on the book. I know a colleague of mine who has a cookbook store in Melbourne.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't muck around with consignment, and I know that's how most bookstores will work with their self-published titles, is it's on consignment.
Mm-hmm.
Majority, so there's a couple of things that he told me about, that he demands a higher margin than typically the 40%.
Mm-hmm.
And even higher if the author is, or the author business is not registered for GST, because we don't get a GST credit then for the purchasing of that book. So it reduces our margin further. So essentially, even though I might take a book that's 40%, if the person doesn't have GST, realistically, it's only a 35% margin.
Mm-hmm.
It costs me to open my front doors 33% to 35% to open my front doors.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, predominantly if I'm getting a 40% margin on most books, I've got 5% to play with.
Mm-hmm.
So the hard answer there is no.
Mm-hmm.
But it's worth talking to any bookstore about that. If it fits within their core group, then they may be happy to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really useful answer. Thank you. It's good to know the mechanics going on behind.
I mean, we'd love to, but it's like you have to keep it that it is a business as well.
Yeah, for sure. And it's one of those things, coming back to again about why it's worth building a relationship with your stores if you're writing, and doing that well before you get to publishing a book.
I saw Kylie Howarth had a question there.
That was my next one.
Oh, good. I can't quite find it again now. Maybe it's which areas of children's books are growing? Mm-hmm. Hi, Kylie. Lovely to see you somewhere on the screen. And you need a shout out for doing over 50 or 60 book fair events, book week events. So I'm sure you need a very stiff drink by now. You must be getting close to the end of it. Which areas of children's books are growing? I don't necessarily have great news for you at the moment, Kylie. I do want to though just let you know, with those figures that I was talking about that are happening in that period 8, where the market was almost 20% down. Unfortunately, when we break that down between the different sectors, children's market, the children's segment was down 25%. So that made me think, okay, 60% of our market is closed down over East. That is having a big impact, more so on children's books, which is weird because, you know, people, the home learning thing is just not very much fun, you know, for parents and for kids. And books, in that first lockdown, books were a way that at least children are reading. We know that the advantages of a well-read child and so that is a concerning figure, that 25% drop. We'll wait and see what happens down the track, but it, you know, I think that WA doesn't need to go into a lockdown like is happening on the eastern states. If I talk to anybody at the moment, it's not a matter of when, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. I've been thinking how we can make sure we protect ourselves as to what's happening on the East Coast with this drop in sales a little bit. And my staff are all vaccinated. I think I'm going to start marketing that. And I just wonder, with the number of voices of authors, whether as an industry, we all need to be out there saying, hey, I'm vaccinated. Because if I have one person like that's one of the other advocacy things that the ABA is doing, is because at the moment there's not a great deal of clarity over what is happening with close and contacts if you are vaccinated. So as they start to open up, there are still going to be cases, there are going to be exposures. Does that mean that if someone comes through a store, that even if all your staff are vaccinated, do you need to then basically close the store down for 14 days or get, and that's where we need rapid testing as well, so that we can clear people to go back to work. So that's some of the stuff that the ABA is trying to get some clarity on at the moment. Children's publishing, ever since I've been open, has been going from strength to strength. Even when the economy was down, children's publishing held up. I think we've just got a blip at the moment in that period 8 figure where it was down 25%. The volume and the value was down. The value being down could just be that there was an extra couple of Bluey books in there because they are a lower priced. So you need to sort of look at the value and volume figures in it. I think as they start to open mid-October, as long as places can stay open, and we are all encouraging people to buy local. So, you know, if you're buying a gift for somebody in Melbourne, ring a Melbourne store and support them, because we could post it to them, but it's going to be better for their business. It's going to be better for our climate, because you're not going to risk it with Australia Post to get across. See you, Karen. I'm doing a conversation with Karen in about 4 or 5 weeks through Fremantle Press, if anyone is interested to get onto that for her new book coming out. So yeah, I think children's publishing, when I see what's coming through between now and Christmas, middle fiction is really, really strong. Junior fiction doesn't have as many titles coming through, which is interesting, because I sit on the panel that actually choose the books that go into the kids reading guide, which is an ABA produced guide. And we had such a strong number of titles in that middle grade, but junior sort of from 7 to 9, not so much. Picture books are doing really well still, and we're seeing them being used throughout different age groups. So not necessarily, we encourage them for still family time reading. So I don't know if that answers your question, Kylie.
I think it answers quite a few.
Probably.
Sort of about like what it's looking like now, and also from a broader picture, and really neatly brings us back to the importance of the ABA as an advocacy body, both in terms of thinking about how we navigate lockdowns as an industry and as booksellers, but also, you know, understanding what impact those sorts of societal changes have on the market, whether it's short term or long term. I might have to bring us to time because we've gone 10 minutes over. I think we got through most questions. If we didn't get through anyone's questions, I apologize. As Jane said, she will be at Karen's event in a few weeks' time, and you can always pop into Beaufort Street and have a look around. Jane,
pop into all your local bookstores.
All your local bookstores, of course.
It is on the 9th of October. It is Love Your Bookshop Day. It is an ABA industry thing. But it's not just for ABA stores. So I'd encourage you to just drop into your local bookstore, drop into 2 or 3 maybe, and just get it on social media. Next week, there is also a celebration of Australian Reading Hour, Tuesday the 14th. And it's about, I would encourage every author just to do something on that day, make a post, because reading, as you all know, is a wonderful mindfulness task. It is, people that can't meditate, reading is a form of meditation, and it enriches lives, it enriches our minds. And you know, if you can just do one post next Tuesday and hashtag Australian Reads, I think that'll help.
Absolutely. And if you want any more information on any of that, you can just hit up Google or the ABA website, and there's loads of resources and info. Jane, thank you so much for giving us all your time today. You're just a font of knowledge, and I'm sure I speak for everyone in the chat that we hugely appreciate the time you've given us today. Thanks to everyone who came along. I hope you enjoyed the session, and keep an eye out for the invitation to the next one, which will be in a few weeks' time, and we'll be chatting to some publishers at Harlequin Books over East. So have a great weekend, everyone, and we'll see you all soon.
Thanks, everyone. See ya.